Hello, hello. Welcome to Developer Essentials. My name is Matt Rosno. With me today, TJ Egan, live from San Jose.
How's it going?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Doing good?
Up and early and ready for the day.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. So this is part 5 of Developer Essentials, where we've started from an empty React app and gone through and built something with Carbon Design System. This is part of Fed at IBM, and we are doing this at 10 plus locations all across the world um, as we go through the 5 different steps. So I really don't have anything to say to recap from the previous week. It seems like things went relatively well. As we go into this week, TJ, if you want to first introduce yourself, maybe share a little bit about your background, what you do on the team,
Yeah.
maybe any sort of contribution areas that you've been more involved with over the past couple of years,
Yeah.
and then we'll
Definitely.
take it from there.
All right. So I'm TJ Egan. I've been with IBM over 3 years now. I started actually on IBM Cloud, and then after a while, I joined the Bluemix components team, which, as you know, is now Carbon Components. And so I've been with Carbon for 2+ years now, working on building the design system. So I've done a lot with theming, part of the data viz, and then have probably had a hand in most of the components. I've tried to stay away from data table as much as possible, but,
it's
but
it's
yeah,
great. Everybody use it. It's just heavy. There's just
uh,
a lot that happens with
it's a
carbon.
monster. It can do a lot.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful component.
Cool. Vanilla, React, and your experience with Carbon
Yeah.
has it been pretty equal or?
It's Yeah, it's been, I mean, when we first started the library, it was just in vanilla. And then, what, 2.5 years ago, uh, the 4 or 5 developers on the team, none of us really knew React. So we were like, oh, this is a good learning experience. Why don't we build all of our components in React? And then it really took off once IBM Cloud then switched to React components. And we were getting contributions and a lot of help and just kind of helping us clean up our best practices in React.
And now look at us today. You know,
Yeah,
very
now
heavy
now we've
React, as
got
well
a
as can't
few
forget
components
Angular and
in
yeah,
Angular.
exactly.
Yeah, it's really expensive and it's great.
Cool. Well, TJ helped put together this material. So do you want to kick things off and letting everybody know
Yeah,
what we're up to this week?
yeah. So this week we're going to be working with deploying our application to IBM Cloud. So I mean, the only real big carbon specific point in this is going to be optimizing our SaaS build. But we're also going to walk you through just kind of some more generic cloud steps, which are going to be creating your cloud account. We're going to show you how to build your app for production. So that means just kind of getting your React out of the dev environment and building for production, which will give you a lot of performance gains. We're going to show you how to create your manifest file, your static file, so that your app's deployed correctly. And then finally, we'll actually get your app deployed and up and running on IBM Cloud. But as far as the optimized SaaS step goes, that's what I kind of wanted to dig into and just kind of give you a little overview of what we've been doing and what we're going to be doing in this one. So currently, we've been just importing every single style from Carbon, which it pulls in components that we're not using, and it's a pretty big file. So we're going to go through and just kind of change it into scoped imports. And so if you take a look at our styles.scss file, uh, you can see that we're pulling in every single helper mix-in, every single variable, stuff that you're probably not going to be using. And then we're also pulling in every single component. So like we're pulling in slider in here and we're not using a slider in this component. So we're going to show you how to just pull in the styles for the components that they need. And so if you take a look at a component like button or something, you'll see that each component is going to pull in just the variables and mixins that it's going to need to compile itself. And we also have a nice, if you see there on line 12, we have an import once function. So I mean, each one of these components is going to be pulling in like vars and typography. That import once mixin will just ensure that we never import that file multiple times. So it's just another kind of check we have in place to make sure that we don't add any unnecessary bloat to your compiled CSS files.
So yeah, let's look at total number of lines of styles.scss. So we're at 173 lines, and now a lot of this is in the form of Sass doc, so we can generate documentation around that. But let's go back to what we can trim this down to, and I'll expand this if you want to speak to.
Yeah, so I mean, now we're going from, instead of importing, what, 30 plus components, we're importing, what, 7 or 8 of them. So that's going to help us save a ton of size just in our entire compiled CSS output. So I think we have the network tab up and running, and we can kind of, I think this one almost cuts it in half, I think.
Yeah, let me
Might be
just
even
do a
more.
hard refresh. So here we have a development environment up and going.
Yeah.
And what TJ, what are we looking at here?
And, well, actually, I don't even see the CSS file.
Let me do another hard refresh.
All right. No, it's still not there. But regardless, I think when we did this earlier, I think it was about 100 kilobytes.
Yeah, I can't remember the actual
Yeah,
value of what
I'm
it
not
was.
sure why it's disappearing, because it's definitely getting chunked in. Okay. Oh, here we go. This is this is what, at the end of last week, so the beginning of this week, you can see there's our unbroken up CSS file. So it's 34 kilobytes. That's pulling in everything. That's going to have every component CSS, everything that we would need. And then I think in the next tab, is that the one that we have? Yeah. And so by just changing it to scoped imports, we can cut the CSS file in half. And then I think the one with your local host has React running in development. And so you can see you got a big chunk up there that is 904 kilobytes. And so that's transferring 1.5 megabytes. And then when we put in the correct environment and variable, which Netlify will handle for us, that's going to make React compile for production, which is going to give you a ton of performance gains, and it's going to cut it down. I mean, we're down to 764 kilobytes. So, I mean, we trimmed off half of our size just by scoping our imports with our CSS and making sure that we're using the production build of React, which will not give you source maps and it'll minify your code. So it's much more performant.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, when as you go through step 5, this seems you compare the previous styles at SCSS to the 9 lines that you replace that with, and it seems very straightforward. And what I recommend is opening up your node modules folder and navigating to the actual styles.scss file that you're importing, and then just looking and seeing what that's doing. And you kind of have to reverse engineer it a little bit. Be like, okay, this is importing the button. Let's look at the button. Okay, the button is importing variables and theme and import once and whatnot. So then, we could have included a lot of those helpers in here as well. There wouldn't have been any harm in doing so. Just for this example, we kept it simple because we knew that these components pulled in the required Sass imports that it needs to render itself, and then once it's in there, we can use it during the rest of this build.
Yep. And I think that was also just another thing that we've learned over time, because we didn't always have the components just directly import their dependencies. We would have them, all right, after you'd have to import all those things yourself under global vars, and now we've just kind of simplified it more so that if you just pull in button, you'll get everything you need for button.
Mm-hmm. Great. So yeah, let me scroll up to the top of our outline here for step 5. So walking through this, just a couple gotchas. So we're going to be deploying our app to IBM Cloud. If you don't have an IBM Cloud account yet, and if you work at IBM, we recommend that you use your IBM.com email address. Things are just easier, and then it'll do the single sign-on with W3 to instantly create that account. So we have instructions on how to do that. When it comes to building for production, let me scroll down to this section. We have a script defined in package.json that said yarn build. And behind the scenes, that's running the script called React scripts build. And so since we're using create React app, we haven't ejected this, meaning we're just using the default settings from create React app, and that's great. I think it'd be a really good exercise if you wanted to eject that so you could play around with the Webpack config to see everything that's happening behind the scenes. So for example, for each pull request we create, since we're using Netlify, that creates the preview deploys. And so what you haven't seen, let me pull this up around here. So this is the Netlify settings for Carbon tutorial that we're just all using. Here are the build settings. So once a pull request happens and it triggers a deploy preview build, we're running yarn build, and then we're telling Netlify that we're going to be looking for the static assets of our web app in a build directory. So that's how it's working. So in all of our deploy previews, if I go to this one, like, we are using the production build, we just haven't called that out yet. And that's why we wanted to show the before and after of optimizing our CSS output for that purpose. So going back to the tutorial here, here we link out to it the production build guidelines coming from Create React App. So this is a really good read. Really no point in us duplicating this information here, but it just shows, like, hey, this builds to a build directory. Going through this, it does minification, it does bundling of your JavaScript, and if you would eject this and play with it yourself, you can do a bunch of different bundling configurations. So maybe, hold on, let me look at this. So it builds all the application code and everything in main.hash.chunk.js. So you may be curious, like, what's a hash? Like, why are hashes used? Well, during the build process, it takes the file and it generates this unique hash to represent that file. So then if the file changes in the future, that hash will also change, and then we can use that for different caching purposes. You can also set up your bundling, so maybe you have one bundle or JavaScript file for just your vendor JavaScript and a separate bundle for your app specific code, so that maybe if you're deploying frequently but you're not touching your vendor JavaScript, each time you deploy, your vendor JavaScript will stay cached because you didn't change it. So then on that next page load, there's only that one new round trip to get the new app specific JavaScript from the server. So bundling, minification, caching techniques, that's all coming out of the box. You can customize it. Code splitting. TJ, did you have anything to share about that with React? I know we're not using it for this tutorial, But
Yeah, we're not using it because the application itself is pretty small, but it's just something that you should definitely look into if you have a larger application. You can use React code splitting to just kind of bundle up your component or your application and just pull in specific components when they're actually being used. So you don't have to serve just one gigantic JavaScript file.
yeah, and a lot of this is like as you're doing development, like do you need to worry about this stuff during initial development? Maybe no, but it's always nice to know what the end result is going to be. And even if you're not part of your team's build team, knowing how it's going to knowing how it's going to be used just helps you better define your own definition of done, so that you just know the required effort that's going to take to get it there once you do deploy. It's just always nice knowing the
Yes.
end result to inform your day to day. So if you're cutting corners, you know that you're going to have to optimize things or compress things or hash things at some point in the future.
Yeah.
This also goes into how it is doing static file caching, the headers it's setting, and using those hashed file names. So this is a good read. I recommend checking it out. Anything else when it comes to building for production, styling JavaScript?
I mean, another big thing that you can do to really improve your performance and just your end build size is doing any kind of image optimization. So if you're using SVGs, you can use something like SVG Go. I think they have something that you can plug into Webpack that'll just kind of maximize your SVGs before they're built for production. And then you pointed out an application, what, Image Magic,
Yeah, so
that, yeah, you can go ahead and talk about it.
yeah, so as TJ and I were talking through different ways to manage imagery. This is my personal preference. It may not be the right way to do things, but I try to rely on our tooling as much as possible. So for things like any sort of SVG assets, it's awesome just to let your build chain optimize that, so you don't have to worry about it. Personally, whenever I work with PNGs or JPEGs, so for example, let's go to our app here, and let's look at this image right here. So if I open this in a new tab, it's a big image. If I go full size here, and that's because we saved it big enough so that we can size it in half so that on Retina displays it comes in and it's crisp. You can go through and have your build auto crunch and optimize these images, but when I work with these sort of raster images, I like to do it myself just to make sure I don't over optimize and then lose some of the fidelity that we're looking for. So tools that I use, tinyjpeg, tinypng.com. It's a public site. You can just drop an image in there or a directory of images, and it usually crunches it down to like 30% of the original size. So that's good. It's public. The reason I brought up Image Magic is if you can't use a public tool like this, then Image Magic, it's a CLI. You can install it to compress your imagery through scripting or the command line. Another really neat thing with Webpack, which Create React App uses, if you eject that and be able to configure it yourself, is just image loaders. So you can configure the settings. So if you need to render a foreground image, you can specify this threshold where it's like, okay, if it's under 20 kilobytes or whatever you set, it'll base 64 encode it and put it right there in line in the page. So there's no extra network requests to get that file, where if it's over the threshold, it's like, okay, we're just going to let the browser request that image. So there's a lot you can do when it comes to how you compress your images, how you load your images. Do you use any sort of spriting and whatnot? So those are just some things to consider. We didn't really go over those during the tutorial, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Carbon tutorial Slack channel. Something else that I wanted to bring up, in step 2 of the tutorial, we added the React router. And let me pull up the example here. In doing so, instead of using the normal browser router, we use the hash router. And so as you navigate, you'll notice in the URL, instead of it just being here, like, you know, .netlify.com/repositories, there's the hash in there. And the reason why we did that was just for simplicity, for deployment purposes. So for example, when this page loads, it goes in and we're only loading one page, which in turn is index.html. If we didn't have the hash in here, it would be looking to load this page called repos. Well, this is a single page application. We don't have a file on disk called repos. And so there's multiple ways around this. For simplicity, we said, hey, we're just going to use the hash router, so we're just loading one file. If I would go in, and here we can try it. It's like, hey, give me the repo stage. Oh, file not found. So in Netlify, or wherever we're deploying to, the correct way to do this is you can go in and you can set redirect rules. So at least how you do this in Netlify, you can create underscore redirect, and then in there put in this very simple rule that says, hey, any route that we get, return success and give me index.html file. So that would be the proper way to do it. Other ways, if we wanted to create a very simple Express app behind the scenes, we can do the route redirecting there. So yeah, just a little background behind why we chose hash router in the past. So then after, let me go back to our outline. After we go through, we create our IBM Cloud account, we optimize our Sass build, we run the yarn build, which is using the create React app scripting to do the production build and put it in the build folder. The next thing we got to figure out is how do we deploy this to something besides Netlify. And so for that, we chose IBM Cloud. And so in here, we go through, and in the instructions, we have you install the Cloud Foundry command line interface. You can also use the IBM Cloud CLI. If you work in cloud, and you have a better recommended way on how to do this, we're all ears, and we'll update the tutorial, because there's just so many ways to do it. We said, okay, we're just going to go with the most simple route in case maybe you're using the Cloud Foundry CLI for deploying to places besides IBM Cloud. So in doing so, we link out to some things that explain what's going on here. We're using a static file build pack. Static file meaning we're deploying a web app that doesn't have any backend. It's just a web application and that's it. And in doing so, you create this manifest.yaml file, and in there you specify a name of the application. In here, just put in your public GitHub username or just something unique, so we don't all try to deploy to the same mybluemix.net URL. And then also with that, in step 3, when we did the data table part where we created the GitHub personal access token, we save that in .env.local. And so as you push up to IBM Cloud, that file still gets used, so there's really no changes there. Other ways you can accomplish that, if you go into IBM Cloud, you can add an environment variable there as well. Or you can also add it as an option in the manifest file, but since we're committing this manifest file up to GitHub, we just exclude it from there. So that's one gotcha. In doing so, with our build pack, you create this file called static file, and it just says, hey, just like in Netlify in our settings where we said the published directory is build, this is a comparable statement that says we're going to be serving this app out of the build directory. And then also, when we did this, we came across an issue where the deploys were failing because of this file permission error. So you can set up a .cfignore file. So as you push to IBM Cloud, you can specify different directories or files or anything in the cloud format of what to not include. I guess you could probably exclude all of node modules, but we just excluded what was thrown in the error, which was the .cache directory. So then going down here, we included the commands with the Cloud Foundry CLI. If you want to use the IBM Cloud one, here's on cloud.ibm.com and their docs. You can get information of what that alias is for Cloud Foundry, or just the different additional IBM Cloud developer tools that come with that. And so it's a matter of calling the cf push command, and then we specify the manifest file that we're using. And then what we do here is a final step is in our package.json, we add a deploy script, and we need to update this so it works on Windows as well. For that, we apologize, but it's a matter of nuking the build directory, running yarn build, and then pushing up to IBM Cloud and doing that deployment. And when you create your own script, it's just nice so that you're running one command and you're guaranteeing that you've done the production build, and then you immediately deploy after that, just so you're not deploying something that is not a production build. So I think one of the other things I wanted to show off here was looking like, okay, so this is a very simple app. How else could we do this, or how else could deployments be done in more of a continuous integration environment? And so just looking at the Carbon website, we use Circle CI to run our builds, and I think it's neat just to look through this to see it in entirety. So when we deploy to our Carbon website, we go through and we make sure that Yarn's installed, and then you'll notice that we have Yarn configured in the Carbon tutorial to use an offline mirror. And by that I meant in steps 2 and 3, as we installed things and you committed things, it included the offline compressed files. So I mean, in more of a CI environment, this is nice, because if npm is flaky, it doesn't matter, because we have all the dependencies that we need to build our app. So then you'll also notice in the Carbon tutorial, we're doing yarn CI check, and right now that's only doing formatting, but in a real application, we would also include tests. So we install things, we run our tests. Once that's good, we go in, and then you'll notice that here, we are using the IBM Cloud CLI. We're authenticating, we're specifying the space and the org. And then one other thing that we're doing is blue-green deployments. Something else, if you're not familiar with that, it's just a good thing to know. And so what that does is, when you deploy, your web app is going to be down in the time it takes for it to rebuild and then deploy itself again. And so in a blue-green environment, I think I have this open. Yeah, here we go. And so what this does is when we deploy to the Carbon website, it creates this temporal route that turns it over to, I guess that would be green. And then it builds the new app. Once that completes, then it flips the route back to the original, and then it deletes that temporal app that was just built. So we're using blue-green deployments as well as we go in, and then here we specify which manifest file we're using. So by default, if you do cf push, it uses the manifest.yaml file in your root directory. It's just a good practice to specify which file you're using in case you do have multiple deploy configurations. So yeah, I don't really know if we deploy to an internal Carbon website anymore or not, but that's why we have manifest external.yaml. There are a couple other topics that aren't really worth going into right now, but when it comes to deployment, especially with any sort of single page application, is pre-rendering. So just to show you, a quick example, if we would go here and let's look at this initial file that we request, it comes back and there's nothing to render here because the page hasn't ran yet. And so you can either use a third-party pre-rendering service, so that when any sort of Googlebot or crawler requests your site, it's like, oh, this is Google, let's redirect this to a pre-rendering service so then it can return the full page in entirety. Another thing that you can look at is server-side rendering, which React has support for. And so for that, you would need to be running a server so that on initial page load, it includes your full DOM, which then your app bootstraps and then runs as a single page application from there. And so that's good for performance. It's good for SEO. And really just it depends on what you're building, right? So we're over time. Any questions in the YouTube channel? Kelly, have you been monitoring this?
There are questions. I think we should just keep the chat open and answer those as we let everybody go.
Cool. Sounds good. So a couple of reminders. Carbon Dash tutorial on Slack. We appreciate the community involvement. If you have questions, if you have suggestions, yeah, please go there. In terms of logistics here and badging and shirts and verifying completion of developer essentials, we will be following up soon with those details. We're just figuring out a couple final approvals for the badge and shirts and logos and whatnot. So we'll get that out to you hopefully later this week once we have something that we can share. So that is it for today. TJ, any final words?
No, that's it. Have fun with this one.
Next education.
Yeah, so coming up, the next Vegetation event is going to be July 9th, and that's going to resume the normal cadence. So July 9th, the next Vegetation event. When it comes to your PRs, just make sure to, as you submit PRs and your local Fed branch leaders are reviewing those, if they have requested any sort of changes, go ahead and check those out and please make those changes, because our distributed team is hard at work just not just verifying that things are done correctly, but making sure that it's the correct learning opportunity. So for badging, we will need those 5 PRs verified and completed. So that is it for today. TJ, thanks for joining.
Yeah, anytime.
And we will keep the YouTube open for any sort of Q&A. All right, thanks. Take care.
Bye, TJ.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
See ya.